On August 15th, 778 CE, in the narrow defiles of the Pyrenees Mountains, one of the most devastating ambushes in medieval military history unfolded. A small force of Basque warriors, numbering approximately 300 fighters intimately familiar with their mountainous homeland, descended upon the rearguard of Charlemagne's mighty Frankish army as it retreated from a failed campaign in Iberia. What followed was not a conventional battle, but a masterclass in guerrilla warfare, a brutal demonstration of how terrain, timing, and intimate local knowledge could overcome vastly superior numbers and military might. The engagement, immortalized in the epic poem The Song of Roland, and known to history as the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, resulted in the complete annihilation of Charlemagne's rearguard, which numbered several thousand men. Among the dead lay some of Francia's most distinguished nobles and warriors, including Roland, the legendary paladin who would become the subject of countless medieval tales. The Basques achieved this devastating victory not through superior equipment or training, but through an intimate understanding of mountain warfare, perfect exploitation of terrain, and the element of complete surprise. This catastrophic defeat would haunt Charlemagne for the rest of his life, representing one of the few significant military setbacks in his otherwise triumphant career. Yet the true story of this ambush has often been obscured by legend, romanticized in epic poetry, and complicated by the sparse historical record. This account examines how a numerically inferior force achieved such a complete and brutal victory, exploring the tactical, geographical, and cultural factors that turned a mountain pass into a killing ground. The stage, Charlemagne's Spanish campaign. To understand the ambush at Roncevaux, we must first examine the circumstances that brought Charlemagne's army into the Pyrenees. In 777, Charlemagne received envoys from several Muslim governors in Iberia who were engaged in internal conflicts within the fragmented Umayyad Caliphate of Córdoba. These governors, including Sulayman al-Arabi, the Wali of Barcelona and Girona, offered to submit to Frankish authority in exchange for military support against their rivals. For Charlemagne, this represented an irresistible opportunity, the chance to expand Frankish influence beyond the Pyrenees, establish a buffer zone against Muslim raids, and enhance his reputation as a Christian monarch fighting the infidel was too tempting to ignore. In the spring of 778, he assembled a massive army, drawing forces from across his growing empire. Contemporary sources vary on the exact size, but estimates suggest Charlemagne commanded between 15,000 and 20,000 warriors, an enormous force by 8th century standards. The campaign began with promise. Charlemagne's army crossed the Pyrenees and laid siege to Zaragoza, one of the key cities promised by the rebellious governors. However, the situation quickly deteriorated. The promised support failed to materialize as expected, and Zaragoza's defenses proved stronger than anticipated. Political complications arose when Charlemagne learned that Saxony, a region he had been working to pacify and Christianize, had erupted in rebellion during his absence. Faced with a stalemate in Iberia and urgent problems at home, Charlemagne made the decision to withdraw. Before departing, however, he committed an act that would have profound consequences. As his army passed through Pamplona, the principal city of the Basques, Charlemagne ordered its walls demolished. This destruction was likely intended to prevent the city from serving as a base for raids into Frankish territory, but it represented a grave insult to the proud Basque people and a direct threat to their security. The Frankish army then began its long march home through the Pyrenees, laden with whatever plunder they had managed to gather during the campaign. They were organized in a traditional marching formation, stretched out over many miles of mountain roads, with the main body led by Charlemagne himself, followed by a substantial rearguard commanded by some of his most trusted nobles, the Basques, masters of their mountains, To understand how such a small force could devastate a much larger army, we must examine who the Basques were and why they were so formidable in their native terrain. The Basque people occupied the Western Pyrenees, a region of rugged mountains, deep valleys, and dense forests straddling what is now the border between France and Spain. They were and remain a distinct ethnic group, speaking Euskara, a language unrelated to any other known tongue in Europe, suggesting their ancient roots in the region. By the 8th century, the Basques had a well-earned reputation as fierce warriors who had successfully resisted Roman conquest, Visigothic domination, and Frankish expansion. They were not a unified kingdom, but rather a collection of related tribes and clans, each fiercely independent and bound by ancient customs and kinship ties. Their society was organized around extended family groups, with leadership often based on proven ability rather than strict hereditary succession. The Basque economy was primarily pastoral, centered on sheep and cattle herding in the mountain valleys. This lifestyle meant that Basque men spent much of their lives moving through steep, rugged terrain, developing an unparalleled familiarity with every path, ravine, and hidden approach in their homeland. They were accustomed to hardship, capable of covering great distances over difficult ground, and comfortable operating in the vertical landscape that would prove so treacherous for the Franks. Basque military tradition emphasized mobility, individual initiative, and the effective use of terrain. Their typical warrior was lightly equipped compared to Frankish heavy cavalry and infantry. A Basque fighter might carry a javelin or two, a short sword or long, knife, and perhaps a small shield. Some used bows or slings. This light equipment meant they could move quickly and quietly through mountain terrain that would exhaust and slow heavily armored troops. The Basques practiced a form of warfare that would today be recognized as guerrilla tactics. They excelled at ambushes, hit-and-run raids, and the exploitation of local knowledge to compensate for inferior numbers or equipment. They were masters at using high ground, natural obstacles, and the element of surprise to neutralize enemy advantages. Most importantly, they understood that in mountain warfare, the army that controls the heights controls the battlefield. The destruction of Pamplona's walls had provided both motive and opportunity. The Basques had been given a clear provocation, and they knew that the Frankish army, burdened with plunder and stretched out in a long, vulnerable column, would have to pass through the narrow defiles of the Pyrenees to return home. For warriors who knew every stone and path in these mountains, it was an opportunity that called for action. The geography of death. Roncevaux Pass. The specific location of the ambush, known as Roncevaux Pass or the Pass of Roncesvalles, was ideally suited for the kind of attack the Basques planned. Located at an elevation of approximately 1,000 meters in the Western Pyrenees, the pass represented one of the few practical routes for a large army crossing between Iberia and Francia. The modern town of Roncesvalles sits near the traditional site of the ambush, though the exact location remains subject to scholarly debate. The terrain in this region is characterized by steep, heavily forested slopes, rising sharply on both sides of the narrow valley floor. The road itself, even in Charlemagne's time, was little more than a rough track winding through the mountains, barely wide enough for a column of men marching 2 or 3 abreast, with no room for wagons or cavalry to maneuver effectively. Dense beech and oak forests covered the slopes, providing perfect concealment for attackers while limiting visibility for those on the road. The geography created a natural funnel, forcing the Frankish column to stretch out over a considerable distance. With the entire army numbering 15,000 to 20,000 men, plus camp followers, supply wagons, and pack animals, the column would have extended for several miles through the mountains. This meant that when the rear guard came under attack, the main body would be too far ahead to provide immediate assistance, especially given the difficulty of reversing course on a narrow mountain road. The slopes rising above the pass were particularly treacherous. They were steep enough to be exhausting to climb while wearing armor and carrying weapons, yet not so steep as to be impassable for lightly equipped fighters familiar with the terrain. The forest cover meant that attackers could approach to within a few dozen meters of the road before being detected. Then either throw javelins and rocks down onto the column or charge downhill, with gravity adding momentum to their assault. Additional tactical features made the site even more favorable for an ambush. Several ravines and small streams cut across the main valley, creating natural obstacles that would break up any attempt by the Franks to form organized defensive positions. The path itself included sections where it narrowed even further, creating choke points where a small number of defenders could hold up a much larger force. Rocky outcrops provided positions from which projectiles could be hurled with devastating effect onto troops packed tightly on the road below. The timing of the ambush, in mid-August, also played a role. Summer foliage would have been at its thickest, maximizing concealment for the Basques. The days were long, but the narrow valley and surrounding peaks meant that shadows fell early, and once the sun dropped behind the western mountains, darkness would come quickly, favoring defenders who knew the terrain intimately over attackers trying to organize a pursuit in unfamiliar mountains. For the Basques planning their attack, every aspect of this geography was an advantage to be exploited. For the Frankish rearguard, it represented a nearly perfect killing ground where all their advantages in numbers, equipment, and training would be neutralized by terrain that made organization impossible and retreat deadly. The Frankish rearguard. Doomed by duty. The composition and leadership of the Frankish rearguard would prove crucial to understanding both why it was targeted and why its destruction was so devastating to Charlemagne. The rearguard was not a random collection of troops, but rather included some of the most important nobles in the Frankish kingdom, along with elite warriors and heavily laden supply trains. At the head of the rearguard rode Roland, the commander of the Breton March and one of Charlemagne's most trusted paladins. Later legend would transform Roland into the archetypal Christian knight, but the historical figure was a Frankish noble of considerable rank and military reputation. Alongside him were other distinguished leaders, including Egihard, the royal seneschal who managed the king's household and estates, and Archbishop Turpin of Reims, a warrior bishop who combined religious authority with military leadership. The rearguard's mission was to protect the army's vulnerable tail from pursuit or harassment, ensure that stragglers kept up with the main column, and guard the baggage train carrying plunder and supplies. This meant they were responsible for the slowest-moving elements of the army, including heavily loaded wagons that could barely navigate the rough mountain roads. Their pace was necessarily slow, creating an ever-widening gap between them and the faster-moving main body led by Charlemagne. The warriors of the rearguard represented the cream of Frankish military might. Many were mounted, wearing chainmail or scale armor, and carrying long spears, swords, and shields. These were the heavy cavalry that had made Charlemagne's armies nearly invincible in open battle, capable of devastating charges that could break enemy formations. However, in the narrow confines of a mountain pass, their horses became liabilities rather than assets, and their heavy armor, which provided protection in conventional warfare, would prove exhausting and limiting in the vertical terrain of the ambush site. The rearguard also included a significant number of foot soldiers, both professional warriors and levies drawn from Frankish territories. These men were better suited to mountain fighting than the cavalry, but they were trained for set-piece battles where organized formations and mutual support were possible. The narrow road made it impossible to maintain proper battle formations, stringing the infantry out in a long, vulnerable line. Perhaps most critically, the rearguard was burdened with the psychological weight of success and expectation. These were victorious warriors returning from campaign, their minds already turning toward home. The main threats they anticipated were potential pursuit by Muslim forces from Iberia or harassment by bandits. The idea that the Basques, whom the Franks likely viewed as primitive mountain folk, would dare to attack the army of the mighty Charlemagne probably seemed remote. This combination of complacency, physical exhaustion from weeks of campaigning, and the difficulty of maintaining vigilance in rugged terrain made them vulnerable despite their military prowess. The presence of so many high-ranking nobles in the rearguard has puzzled historians. Some suggest it was a mark of honor, trusted to the most capable commanders. Others propose that these nobles were assigned to the rearguard precisely because it was considered safe, with the main threats already neutralized. Whatever the reason, it meant that the ambush would not just destroy men, but decapitate a significant portion of Frankish leadership, making the disaster far more impactful than mere numbers would suggest. The ambush orchestrated chaos. The attack itself was a masterpiece of timing and coordination that demonstrated sophisticated planning despite the Basques' lack of a formal military hierarchy. Historical sources provide only limited details about the actual fighting, but by combining what we know with an understanding of the terrain and tactical principles, we can reconstruct the likely sequence of events. The Basque force, numbering around 300 warriors, had positioned themselves carefully along the slopes overlooking the pass. They were almost certainly divided into multiple groups, each assigned to a specific section of the road. This allowed them to attack the extended Frankish column at multiple points simultaneously, preventing mutual support and creating chaos along the entire length of the rearguard. The warriors would have taken their positions hours before the attack, moving silently through forests they had known since childhood, using game trails and hidden paths invisible to outsiders. The ambush likely began with a deadly rain of projectiles. Javelins, rocks, and arrows suddenly flew down from the slopes onto the unsuspecting Franks below. In those first terrible moments, dozens or perhaps hundreds of men fell without ever seeing their attackers. Horses reared and panicked, creating further chaos on the narrow road. Wagons crashed into each other as terrified draft animals tried to flee. The close quarters meant that even warriors not directly hit by missiles were in immediate danger from stampeding animals and falling comrades. Before the Franks could organize any coherent response, the Basques charged down from their concealed positions. The steep slopes gave them tremendous momentum, and their light equipment allowed them to navigate the treacherous terrain at speed. They struck the Frankish column at multiple points simultaneously, fragmenting it into isolated groups that could be overwhelmed piecemeal. The attack was perfectly timed for maximum psychological impact, the sudden transition from peaceful march to violent chaos, leaving the Franks no time to mentally prepare for battle. The Frankish heavy cavalry, which should have been the army's most powerful weapon, proved almost useless. Mounted warriors needed space to maneuver and charge, but the narrow road and steep slopes made this impossible. Many were pulled from their horses or killed while still mounted, unable to bring their primary advantage into play. Those who managed to dismount found their heavy armor a burden rather than a protection, exhausting them as they tried to fight uphill against lighter, faster opponents who could retreat into the forest whenever pressed too hard. The Frankish infantry attempted to form shield walls and defensive formations, but the terrain made this nearly impossible. A shield wall requires level ground and soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, but the road was too narrow, the slopes too steep, and the attacks coming from too many directions. Small groups of Franks fought with desperate courage, but they were fighting as individuals or small clusters rather than as an organized military force. This negated their advantages in equipment and training. Roland and the other commanders tried to rally their men and organize a coordinated defense, but the speed and chaos of the ambush made command and control nearly impossible. Orders couldn't be heard over the din of battle, and even if they could be heard, executing them in the difficult terrain was another matter. Legend says Roland refused to blow his horn to summon help from the main army until it was too late, an act of pride that doomed his men. Whether this detail is true or legendary embellishment, it captures a real truth. By the time the scale of the disaster became clear, it was too late for rescue. The Basques fought with a clear tactical plan. They focused their attacks on officers and standard-bearers, knowing that killing leaders would sow confusion and demoralize the Franks. They targeted horses and pack animals, creating obstacles on the road that prevented retreat or reinforcement. They struck hard and then melted back into the forest before counterattacks could be organized, using their knowledge of hidden paths to reposition and strike again from a different direction. As the afternoon wore into evening, the situation became increasingly desperate for the Franks. They were divided into small groups, scattered along miles of mountain road, unable to support each other or retreat effectively. Exhaustion set in, the weight of their armor and the stress of fighting on steep slopes draining their strength. The Basques, fighting in familiar terrain and able to rotate fresh warriors into the fight while others rested, maintained their pressure. The final phase of the battle came as darkness fell. With visibility reduced and their position untenable, the surviving Franks attempted to escape or hide. Many were hunted down in the darkness by Basques, who knew every path and hiding place. Others stumbled off the road in the darkness and fell to their deaths on the steep slopes. The baggage train, which had been a primary objective of the attack, was thoroughly plundered. By the time dawn broke, the Frankish rearguard had been completely destroyed. The aftermath. A Pyrrhic victory? The immediate tactical result was a complete Basque victory. The entire Frankish rearguard had been annihilated, with Roland, Egehard, Turpin, and numerous other nobles dead on the field. Thousands of Frankish soldiers had been killed, and the baggage train with its supplies and plunder had been captured. The Basques had achieved this with minimal losses of their own, perhaps a few dozen casualties at most. As a military engagement, it was a masterclass in how a small, mobile force could defeat a much larger army by choosing the right ground and the right moment. However, the strategic aftermath was more complex. Charlemagne, upon learning of the disaster, was said to have wept with rage and grief. He had lost not just men but close companions and trusted advisors. The destruction of so many nobles created succession crises and power vacuums across Francia. The loss of prestige was perhaps even more damaging than the material losses. Charlemagne, who had been building a reputation as an invincible Christian emperor, had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of mountain warriors his own chroniclers often dismissed as primitive. Yet Charlemagne did not immediately seek revenge. The pressing situation in Saxony required his attention, and mounting a punitive expedition into the Basque Mountains would be costly and difficult, with no guarantee of success. The Basques had demonstrated that they could make their homeland a death trap for conventional armies. For several years, Charlemagne focused his military efforts elsewhere, and when he did eventually establish stronger control over the Basque territories, he did so through a combination of military pressure, political accommodation, and the establishment of the Spanish March as a buffer zone. For the Basques, the victory had mixed consequences. In the short term, they had successfully defended their homeland and avenged the destruction of Pamplona. They had proven that they could not be attacked with impunity. The captured plunder enriched the communities that participated in the ambush, However, they had also earned the lasting enmity of the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. While immediate retaliation did not come, Frankish pressure on Basque territories would increase in subsequent decades, leading to gradual incorporation of much of Basque land into Frankish and later Spanish and French kingdoms. The battle also had cultural consequences that far outlived its political impact. The death of Roland and his companions became the foundation for the Song of Roland, one of the most important epic poems of medieval Europe. Written several centuries after the events, the poem transformed the ambush into a grand battle against Muslim forces, turning Roland into a Christian martyr and paragon of chivalric virtue. This legendary version became far more influential than the historical reality, shaping European literature and culture for centuries. The Song of Roland obscured the actual circumstances of the battle, replacing the pragmatic Basques with Saracen armies, and transforming a successful ambush into a tale of glorious last stands and Christian heroism. This literary metamorphosis says much about medieval culture's need for certain types of stories, but it also meant that the real lessons of Roncevaux, about the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare and the limitations of conventional military power in difficult terrain, were largely lost or ignored. Tactical lessons. Why the ambush succeeded. Examining the tactical factors that led to such a complete Basque victory reveals principles that remain relevant to military thinking today. The success of the ambush resulted from the convergence of multiple factors, each reinforcing the others to create conditions where a numerically inferior force could achieve overwhelming victory. Terrain exploitation was paramount. The Basques understood that in mountain warfare, control of the high ground is not merely advantageous but decisive. By positioning themselves on the slopes above the road, they could attack downward, giving them momentum and making it exhausting for the Franks to counterattack uphill. The narrow valley forced the Frankish column to string out over miles, preventing mutual support and allowing the Basques to achieve local numerical superiority at each point of contact, despite their overall smaller numbers. Intelligence and preparation gave the Basques crucial advantages. They knew exactly when and where the Frankish army would pass through their territory. They could choose the optimal ambush site and position their forces in advance. The Franks, by contrast, had limited intelligence about the terrain ahead and no warning of the attack. This information asymmetry meant the Basques could fight the battle on their terms, at the time and place of their choosing. Mobility and equipment appropriate to the terrain proved decisive. The Basques' light equipment allowed them to move quickly through forests and across steep slopes that exhausted heavily armored Franks. They could concentrate for attacks, then disperse and reposition before counterattacks could be organized. The Frankish cavalry, normally their most powerful asset, became a liability in terrain where horses could not maneuver. Heavy armor, designed to protect against sword blows in open battle, simply exhausted its wearers when they had to fight uphill in summer heat. Tactical cohesion versus strategic dispersion was another key factor. The Frankish army was dispersed over many miles of road, making mutual support impossible. The Basques, though spread along the ambush site, were operating according to a coordinated plan and could mass at decisive points. They achieved the military ideal of being divided strategically but concentrated tactically, while the Franks were vulnerable everywhere and strong nowhere. Psychological factors cannot be underestimated. The Basques were fighting on their home ground for their survival and to avenge the destruction of Pamplona. This provided powerful motivation and ensured that warriors who knew and trusted each other fought as cohesive units. The Franks, exhausted from a long campaign and thinking themselves safe, were psychologically unprepared for sudden, violent combat. The shock of the ambush and the rapid disintegration of their formation likely caused panic that made organized resistance nearly impossible. Command and control challenges devastated the Frankish response. In the chaos of the ambush, with attacks coming from multiple directions simultaneously, Frankish commanders couldn't coordinate a response. Even excellent commanders like Roland found their orders impossible to communicate or execute. The Basques, operating in small, independent groups with implicit understanding of the overall plan, maintained tactical flexibility while the Frankish command structure collapsed. Timing was executed with precision. The ambush occurred when the rearguard was most vulnerable, separated from the main army, strung out along the road, and mentally relaxed. The attack began in late afternoon, giving the Basques several hours of daylight to press their advantage, while ensuring that darkness would fall before reinforcements could arrive or survivors could effectively retreat. These tactical factors combined to create what modern military theorists call a catastrophic cascading failure, where initial disadvantages compound rapidly, preventing recovery and leading to complete collapse. The Frankish rearguard was not simply defeated, but annihilated, a testament to how perfectly the Basques had calibrated their attack to the specific conditions, historical significance, and legacy. The Battle of Roncesvalles Pass occupies a unique position in European history, significant both for what actually happened and for how it was remembered and transformed by later generations. Understanding its various layers of meaning requires examining both the immediate historical context and the long cultural shadow it cast. In immediate military terms, Roncesvalles demonstrated the continuing vitality of irregular warfare in an age increasingly dominated by heavy cavalry and siege warfare. While Charlemagne's armies would go on to many more victories, and his empire would grow to encompass much of Western Europe, the memory of this devastating ambush served as a reminder that conventional military superiority could be neutralized by determined defenders using terrain to their advantage. It influenced Frankish military planning in mountainous regions and contributed to the gradual development of lighter, more mobile forces to supplement heavy cavalry. For the Basques, the battle became a cornerstone of ethnic identity and resistance to outside domination. Throughout subsequent centuries of Spanish and French rule, the memory of how their ancestors had humbled the great Charlemagne sustained Basque cultural identity. The battle represented proof that Basque military prowess and the defensibility of their homeland made them a people who could not be easily conquered or absorbed. This cultural memory would influence Basque resistance to centralized authority for more than a millennium. The transformation of the battle in The Song of Roland created a different kind of legacy. By the time this epic poem was composed, probably in the late 11th century, the historical Basque ambush had been reimagined as a massive battle against Saracen forces, with Roland and his companions dying as Christian martyrs rather than victims of a guerrilla attack. This version served the cultural needs of the crusading era, providing a narrative of Christian heroism and sacrifice that inspired knights throughout Europe. The legendary Roland became one of the most important figures in medieval literature, rivaling King Arthur in cultural impact. His story was told and retold in dozens of languages, inspiring artwork, music, and later literature. The historical battle that killed him became almost irrelevant compared to the legend that grew from his death. This demonstrates how historical events can be transformed to serve the cultural and ideological needs of later generations, sometimes to the point where the transformation becomes more influential than the original event. From a military history perspective, Roncesvalles became a case study in asymmetric warfare long before that term was coined. It demonstrated principles that would be rediscovered repeatedly throughout history. That local knowledge and appropriate tactics can overcome technological and numerical superiority. That terrain can be either an army's greatest ally or its doom, and that no force is invincible when fighting on ground chosen by its enemies. These lessons would be learned again in countless conflicts from the American Revolution to modern counterinsurgency operations. The battle also highlights the importance of logistics and rear area security in military operations. Charlemagne's decision to place so many high-ranking nobles in the rearguard, whether from overconfidence or miscalculation, turned a military defeat into a catastrophic loss of leadership. The vulnerability of supply trains and the difficulty of protecting dispersed forces over long distances remain challenges for armies to this day. Conclusion. Echoes through time. The ambush at Roncesvalles Pass stands as one of history's most perfect examples of how a small, determined force with intimate knowledge of local terrain can inflict catastrophic defeat on a much larger, better equipped army. 300 Basque warriors, fighting to defend their homeland and avenge an insult to their principal city, destroyed the rearguard of Charlemagne's army and killed some of the most important nobles in Francia. They achieved this through superior tactical planning, perfect exploitation of mountainous terrain, and the discipline to execute a coordinated ambush across several miles of narrow mountain roads. The battle's immediate consequences were significant but limited. Charlemagne lost trusted advisors and suffered a blow to his prestige, but his empire continued to expand, and his power remained essentially unchallenged. The Basques won a stunning tactical victory, but could not translate it into lasting strategic advantage against the far more powerful Frankish kingdom. Over subsequent generations, Basque territories would gradually be incorporated into larger political entities, though Basque cultural identity and fierce independence would persist. The battle's longer-term significance lies more in what it revealed about warfare and in its cultural transformation. It demonstrated that in appropriate terrain, lightly equipped forces following guerrilla tactics could defeat the heavy cavalry that dominated European warfare. It showed that technology and training, while important, were not decisive advantages when fighting on unfavorable ground against enemies who understood how to exploit every feature of that ground. These lessons would be learned and forgotten repeatedly throughout military history, each time at great cost. The transformation of the battle into the legend of Roland speaks to humanity's need for certain types of stories. The actual battle, while tactically fascinating, did not fit the cultural needs of medieval Christendom. It showed Christians defeated by people who were neither Muslim nor pagan, but fellow Christians, killed not in glorious battle, but in an ambush, while burdened with baggage and unable to maneuver. By transforming the Basques into Saracens and the ambush into a heroic last stand, the Song of Roland created a story that medieval culture needed, one that reinforced values of Christian heroism, loyalty, and sacrifice. Today, Roncesvalles Pass remains a place of pilgrimage, though now primarily for those walking the Camino de Santiago rather than military historians. The narrow roads that witnessed such violence are now peaceful, passing through some of Europe's most beautiful mountain scenery. Yet the story of what happened there in August 778 continues to resonate, a reminder that determination, clever tactics, and knowledge of ground can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds, and that the most devastating defeats often come not in grand battles, but in moments of vulnerability when an army least expects attack. The blood spilled in those mountains more than 12 centuries ago watered legends that would bloom across medieval Europe, while the tactical lessons written in Frankish casualties remain relevant to anyone studying the complexities of warfare in difficult terrain. The Battle of Roncesvalles Pass was, in the end, both a historical event and a legend, both a tactical masterpiece and a catastrophic defeat, both a moment in time and an echo that still sounds through the corridors of history.